By the next morning, the bulldozer was already the talk of the neighborhood. My phone buzzed nonstop with texts and blurry photos, some from neighbors who'd barely spoken to me before, suddenly eager for updates. I could see Karen pacing in her living room, blinds twitching as she peeked out every few minutes, likely calculating just how much of her suburban empire was slipping away with every hour that passed. It felt like the entire street had tuned into a live episode of Suburbia's Got Talent, with Karen as the reluctant star and me as the unexpected fan favorite. But I knew better than to think this was the end. With Karen, the first move was never the last. At sunrise, I watched as she stormed outside, armed with a clipboard, her phone, and what looked like a new sense of righteous determination. She circled the bulldozer, snapping pictures from every angle, her lips pressed so tightly together they nearly disappeared. She called the HOA emergency line, then the non-emergency police line, and, from the sound of her exasperated tone, probably animal control just for good measure. As I sipped my coffee from the porch, I could practically hear her blood pressure rising with each unanswered demand. An hour later, a city code enforcement officer named Dave arrived, stepping out of his dusty sedan with the weary gait of someone who'd seen enough HOA drama for one lifetime. He took in the scene, a massive yellow bulldozer perfectly centered on Karen's pristine driveway, Karen herself gesturing wildly at the offending machine, and me calmly waving from across the street. "Let's try to keep it civil, folks," Dave said, mostly to himself, as Karen launched into a monologue about property rights and egregious homeowner retaliation. She rattled off a list of alleged violations. The bulldozer wasn't permitted, it was an eyesore, it was potentially lowering property values, and it was, worst of all, blocking her from attending her weekly Pilates class. Dave listened, his expression a mix of patience and existential dread. When she finally paused to breathe, he turned to me. "Is this your machine?" he asked. I nodded. "Technically, it's my friend's. But I do have the keys." Karen's eyes narrowed, sensing a loophole slipping away. "Did you have permission to park it here?" Dave continued. I pointed to the orange cone still blocking my own driveway. "Did Karen have permission to block mine?" For a moment, Dave looked like he might actually laugh. He inspected the bulldozer, checked for any obvious code violations, and finally shrugged. "I don't see anything in the city code about bulldozers parked on driveways. It's not blocking the sidewalk or street, so as long as it's not here forever, there's not much I can do." Karen sputtered, demanding to speak to his supervisor. Dave handed her a business card, wished us both luck, and left with the tired resignation of a man who knew he'd be seeing at least one of us again soon. But Karen wasn't finished. She marched back inside, and for the next hour, the hum of her phone calls filled the air. Then, suddenly, a new twist. A tow truck rolled down the street, its driver glancing nervously at the spectacle before him. Karen flagged him down, waving her HOA badge like it was a sheriff's star. The driver got out, took one look at the bulldozer, and shook his head before she even opened her mouth. "Lady, I'd need a crane and a miracle to move that thing," he said, almost apologetically. "And even if I could, I'm not touching it without the owner's permission." He drove away, leaving Karen seething and me struggling not to grin like an idiot. As the morning wore on, word spread. Neighbors wandered over, drawn by the spectacle and the rare opportunity to see Karen on the losing end of a battle. Some offered snacks, a few offered congratulations, and one elderly couple brought lawn chairs, settling in like it was a 4th of July parade. Even the mailman paused, snapping a discreet photo for what I assumed was his own Crazy HOA Stories group chat. By noon, Karen tried a different tack. She emerged from her house with a camera crew in tow. Well, her teenage daughter filming on a phone, but it felt official enough. She began narrating her grievances, giving a full rundown of the malicious harassment and targeted aggression she'd suffered at the hands of a disruptive homeowner. I watched as she ranted about neighborhood safety and moral decay, all while her daughter rolled her eyes behind the camera. If her goal was to look like the hero, she was failing spectacularly. If anything, she was giving the neighborhood an unintentional comedy show. But then, just as I was settling into the rhythm of petty suburban warfare, Karen switched gears. She turned her attention not just to me, but to the entire HOA. By mid-afternoon, she had called an emergency board meeting. Right there on her front lawn, surrounded by folding chairs, iced tea, and a crowd of reluctant board members who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. She waved her phone at them, demanding an immediate amendment to the bylaws prohibiting construction equipment on residential property. Her argument was passionate, if not particularly logical. If left unchecked, who knew what chaos might follow? A fleet of dump trucks, perhaps, or a parade of backhoes. One board member, a thin man named Stan with a permanent sunburn and a love for Robert's Rules of Order, tried to reason with her. Karen, the bylaw amendment process takes months, and we'd need to put it to a vote, he explained, but she cut him off. We can do an emergency session, she insisted, eyes darting toward the growing crowd of neighbors. This is a threat to our community's image. As tempers flared, a few neighbors openly sided with me, pointing out the hypocrisy of Karen's actions. For once, the board wasn't backing her unconditionally. A small mutiny was brewing. And then, as if on cue, a city maintenance truck pulled up. The workers hopped out, inspected the sapling that was supposedly the reason for the original blockade, and declared, after 2 minutes of half-hearted observation, that no trimming was necessary for another year. The tree, it seemed, was in perfect health. The HOA's emergency order was nothing more than an excuse. The crowd murmured, and even Karen's loyalists looked uncomfortable. Sensing her grip on the situation slipping, Karen did something I never expected. She apologized, sort of. She stood up, face red, and announced, "There has clearly been some misunderstanding, and I am willing to discuss a solution." It was the closest thing to contrition I'd ever heard from her. But as I would soon find out, Karen's version of a solution wasn't peace. It was escalation disguised as compromise. She asked to meet with me privately that evening, promising she could work something out, neighbor to neighbor. Curious and cautious, I agreed. When I arrived at her house, she invited me in with forced politeness and sat me down at her kitchen table. She started with compliments about my lawn and my dedication to the community, then segued into a rambling lecture about unity, property values, and mutual respect. Finally, she slid a document across the table, an official HOA complaint against me, citing malicious obstruction of common access, and creating a public nuisance. She offered a deal. Remove the bulldozer within 24 hours, and she'd recommend the board drop all pending fines against me. The last time I saw my driveway, it was the color of freedom. Black asphalt, pocked with oil stains, stretching out from my garage to the road like a promise that I could leave or arrive whenever I wanted. Then came the Monday morning that changed everything. It started with a scraping metallic noise, followed by the unmistakable scent of cheap perfume and a shrill voice bellowing outside my window. I pulled the curtain aside and there she was, a woman built like a retired volleyball champion but with the posture of a drill sergeant, hands planted firmly on her hips. She wore a pink windbreaker, white sneakers, and an expression that screamed middle management gone feral. Behind her, an orange construction cone blocked my driveway and a sign staked into my grass read, in a font somehow both playful and menacing, "Temporary no parking zone by HOA order." My coffee went cold as I tried to process the scene. This was my property, my home, my supposedly quiet suburb. I'd survived 3 hurricanes, 2 market crashes, and 1 questionable deep fryer fire, but I was starting to realize I'd underestimated the storm that is a board homeowners association president. I threw on sweats and went outside, where Karen, her actual name, she'd never forgive her parents, was already talking loudly on her phone, just within earshot. She had a talent for projecting her voice, the kind that turns every minor inconvenience into a town hall debate. "Yes, I'm with the homeowner now," she announced, even though I was still 20 feet away. He's very emotional, poor man, but I have to enforce these bylaws. The community expects it. She shot me a condescending smile, the kind reserved for toddlers and people with overdue library books. When she hung up, I tried the calm, rational approach. Karen, what's this about? I asked, gesturing to the blockade. Oh, did you not get the notice? She replied, feigning shock so poorly that I had to admire the performance. It's for tree trimming on the common property. Emergency order. All driveways on this side are blocked today. I glanced up and down the street. Every other driveway was clear except mine. The only tree remotely near my property was a sapling, planted last fall, currently being ignored by the HOA's own landscaping crew. I wasn't born yesterday. I'd had run-ins with Karen before. She'd left warning notes on my trash cans for being half an inch off the curb, and once threatened to fine me for painting my mailbox navy instead of heritage blue. Still, blocking my driveway was a new level. Why only my house? I pressed, fighting to keep the edge out of my voice. She pursed her lips, glancing theatrically at a clipboard. It's randomized enforcement. We can't show favoritism, can we? She replied, and I nearly laughed at the absurdity. Karen didn't do anything randomly. I had a feeling this was payback for that time I pointed out her own hedges violated the 6-inch height rule. Now, thanks to her, I wasn't going anywhere. The neighbor's dog watched the whole exchange from behind a fence, looking both sympathetic and amused. Around noon, I heard the distinct rumble of a delivery truck struggling to reverse down the street. My wife, Julia, who was 7 months pregnant and not in the mood for suburban politics, tried to reason with Karen from the front porch. We have a doctor's appointment in an hour. Can you please move the cone? Karen smirked, tapping at her phone. Sorry, I can't play favorite. But I'm happy to call the HOA's preferred towing company if you're desperate. Julia looked ready to throw the baby shower and the baby at her in one motion. Instead, she went back inside, muttering something about HOA dictatorships and prenatal rage. The next 3 hours were a comedy of errors, if you find Kafkaesque bureaucracy funny. I called the city. The city said it was an HOA matter. I called the HOA. The HOA put me on hold for 30 minutes before transferring me to Karen's voicemail. I tried moving the cone myself, but Karen, lurking behind her hydrangeas, called out, "Touch that and it's a $200 violation." A couple of neighbors watched from their driveways, eyes darting away when I met their gaze, as if Karen's authority was contagious. At one point, a landscaper approached the sapling, trimmed exactly one leaf, and then left without a word. I realized then this was less about trees and more about power. Karen didn't want compliance. She wanted to win. By 4 o'clock, the sun was sinking and so was my patience. I was still trapped, Julia was missing her appointment, and Karen was sitting on a fold-out lawn chair across the street, sipping lemonade and flipping through a copy of the HOA bylaws like it was the latest thriller novel. I watched her, and she watched me, both of us pretending not to notice the tension simmering in the air. That's when the idea hit me. It wasn't my proudest moment, but desperation and spite make excellent dance partners. I had a friend, Mike, who worked in demolition. Mike owed me for helping him move an entire hot tub last year. I dialed his number and explained the situation. There was a long silence, then he let out a low whistle. "You want the Cat 963? He asked, meaning his beloved 20-ton bulldozer. "How wide's her driveway?" I glanced across the street at Karen's perfectly paved concrete slab. "About as wide as her ego," I replied. Mike laughed. "Give me an hour." When Mike arrived, the neighborhood went from bored suburbia to construction site in about 30 seconds. He rumbled down the street, the bulldozer's blade gleaming in the late afternoon sun. Karen nearly spit out her lemonade. Neighbors emerged from their houses, drawn by the noise, curiosity, or maybe just the chance to see the tyrant taken down a notch. Mike parked the bulldozer dead center in Karen's driveway, its bulk completely blocking her car in the garage. He turned off the engine, hopped down, and handed me the keys like he was dropping off a casserole. Karen stormed across the street, phone in hand, fury etched into every line of her face. "This is harassment. You can't do this. I'll have you arrested," she screeched, voice breaking from the sheer effort. I shrugged, feigning innocence. "Sorry, Karen, I can't play favorite. It's randomized enforcement. Can't move the dozer until the tree is trimmed. Might be here all night." Mike, ever the showman, pulled out a lawn chair and joined me on my front lawn. Julia brought out popcorn. The sun set behind the bulldozer, casting a long shadow across Karen's driveway and her authority. For the first time all day, the balance of power had shifted. Karen, usually the queen of our cul-de-sac, now stood powerless on her own front lawn, trapped by the same arbitrary authority she'd wielded against everyone else. The neighborhood watched in silent approval. I leaned back in my chair, savoring the rare taste of petty justice, and wondered just how far Karen was willing to go to reclaim her throne. I barely slept that night, not for lack of trying. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Karen's plastic smile and the faint reflection of that official complaint glinting under her kitchen light. By morning, I could already sense a shift in the atmosphere of our usually sleepy street. Where there was once mild curiosity, now there was open anticipation. Neighbors walked their dogs a little slower in front of my house. Cars that used to zip by now crept past, drivers craning their necks for a glimpse of the suburban standoff. Even the mailman tipped his cap to me as if I were some folk hero in a small-town legend. I guess that's the price you pay for fighting HOA royalty on her own turf. Julia, who'd mostly observed the drama from a safe distance, finally weighed in over breakfast. "She's not going to back down," she warned, buttering her toast with the same intensity Karen used to enforce parking violations. "And she's definitely not going to forget." She wasn't wrong. Karen's apology had all the sincerity of a customer service chatbot, and I had no illusions about her capacity for grudge-holding. But I also wasn't about to let her bully me into submission, not when she'd set the rules of engagement herself. By mid-morning, I got my first taste of Karen's new plan. It started subtly, a sudden influx of HOA compliance inspections targeting my house. Stan, the bylaw-loving board member, awkwardly knocked on my door holding a tape measure and a clipboard. He apologized as he explained that he was just following up on a random audit. My fence, apparently, was a quarter-inch too high in one corner. My mailbox's paint, still navy, still not heritage blue, was flagged for another warning. Even my recycling bin, which had never before garnered so much as a glance, was now cited for being visible from the street for more than 4 hours on collection day. Julia stood behind me in the doorway, arms crossed, radiating disbelief. I thanked Stan, who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, and promised to review my compliance. Next, Karen escalated from bureaucracy to social warfare. An HOA email blast landed in every inbox on the street, packed with ominous reminders about civic responsibility, communal harmony, and the consequences of disruptive behavior. Though she didn't mention me by name, it was clear who the villain was supposed to be. The tone was pure Karen, calm, official, and laced with the kind of moral superiority only the truly insufferable can pull off. Some neighbors, probably fearing her wrath more than mine, started avoiding eye contact or waving in a way that felt half-hearted, as if friendship itself might be against the rules. But not everyone was buying it. By lunchtime, a small but growing group of neighbors had started congregating on my lawn, openly supporting my stand against Karen's overreach. They brought snacks, folding chairs, and stories of their own run-ins with the HOA president. There was Mr. Sanders, whose flower beds were cited for excessive vibrancy, Maria, who'd received a warning for letting her Halloween decorations linger past November, and old Mrs. Quinn, who'd once been fined for improper flag etiquette during Flag Day. With every news story, the mood shifted from passive resignation to something bordering on rebellion. Karen, ever the opportunist, tried to reclaim her narrative. She called a special HOA meeting at the community center that evening, inviting all residents for an open dialogue about neighborhood standards. Her plan was clear: drown me out in officialdom, use the power of procedure to grind me into submission, and remind everyone who was really in charge. But by then, the bulldozer was more than a machine. It was a symbol, a middle finger to arbitrary authority. The meeting was packed, standing room only, with at least half the neighborhood showing up for the first time since the association was formed. Karen started the meeting with a slideshow about the importance of rules, displaying graphs and pie charts nobody understood. She used words like synergy and stakeholder engagement, as if reading from a corporate playbook. But when the floor opened for comments, something remarkable happened. The neighborhood pushed back. Stan tried to raise his usual procedural motions, but Maria cut him off, citing the HOA's own bylaws on member speech. Mr. Sanders demanded to know why only some properties ever seemed to get randomly selected for inspection. Even Mrs. Quinn, walking cane in hand, stood and announced she'd rather risk the wrath of a bulldozer than another one of Karen's newsletters. Karen's composure cracked. She responded with a speech about the dangers of mob mentality, but by then, the crowd was restless and skeptical. I took my turn at the mic, keeping my words calm and measured. I explained how I'd asked for fairness, how the blockade had forced my pregnant wife to miss her appointment, and how the bulldozer had been a direct response to a misuse of power. I didn't ask for sympathy. I just wanted consistency. I reminded everyone that the rules should protect us, not be used as weapons by those with a grudge. A slow clap started in the back, probably Mrs. Quinn, who had nothing to lose, and soon the room was buzzing with approval. Still, Karen wasn't out of moves. As the meeting ended, she cornered a few nervous board members and whispered furiously. Minutes later, an official notice was posted on the HOA website. All heavy machinery and construction vehicles must be removed from residential property within 24 hours, effective immediately. It was classic Karen: if you can't win by the old rules, make up some new ones. I half expected her to announce a neighborhood-wide ban on anything painted yellow for good measure. But here's the thing about hastily written rules: they leave loopholes. The new bylaw, rushed and poorly thought out, specified construction vehicles but failed to address guest parking or visiting service vehicles. It also said nothing about who could enforce the rule or what the penalties would be. My friend Mike, sensing the tide turning, showed up in his pickup truck with a sign taped to the back window: "Bulldozer on loan for community beautification." For legal purposes, we decided the dozer was just visiting, an honorary guest of the neighborhood. That night, as the sun dipped low behind the houses, Julia and I sat on the porch, watching as the bulldozer, now adorned with homemade signs reading "Long Live the Dozer" and "Karen-Free Zone," became a gathering point for the neighbors. Someone even brought a Bluetooth speaker, blasting classic rock, and for the first time in years, our street felt more like a community than a collection of strangers. Kids posed for photos in front of the dozer, couples strolled by and shook my hand, and even Stan, notebook in hand, allowed himself a quiet grin. Karen, meanwhile, stayed inside with her blinds drawn, plotting her next move. But as midnight approached, the real twist revealed itself. Mike got a call from his company's legal department. Someone had reported the bulldozer as stolen equipment used for intimidation. The police were on their way, ready to investigate what they'd been told was a full-blown neighborhood feud gone nuclear. As I watched blue lights flicker at the end of the street, I realized Karen wasn't just fighting for control anymore, she was fighting for survival, her reputation on the line. And now, thanks to her, the whole thing was about to go public in a way no HOA newsletter ever could. After the meeting, the air in our neighborhood changed almost overnight. There was a sense of relief and renewal, like someone had finally cracked open a window after years of stale, recycled air. For the first time in ages, people lingered outside, talking openly on front lawns, waving at each other as they walked dogs or watered flowerbed. Kids played basketball in driveways, their laughter echoing into the evening instead of being shushed by self-appointed rule enforcers. The bulldozer still sat in Karen's driveway, but now it felt less like a weapon and more like a landmark, a monument to the moment when the neighborhood finally said, "Enough." But just because Karen was under investigation didn't mean she was gone, or that the HOA's drama was over. The board moved quickly, meeting twice in the following week to review documents, interview witnesses, and debate next step. My lawyer attended every session, sharp and thorough, making sure the process stayed transparent. Meanwhile, Karen retreated almost entirely from view. Her car rarely left the garage, her curtains stayed drawn, and if she did step outside, it was only to snatch up her mail with the urgency of someone expecting a subpoena. I caught her peeking through her blinds a few times, but she never made eye contact. The silence from her corner of the street was almost unsettling, a calm before a storm or maybe the uneasy peace that comes after one. One morning, Julia and I sat on our porch with mugs of coffee, watching the bulldozer glint in the sunlight. She nudged me with a smile. "You realize you might have started a revolution, right?" I shrugged, feigning innocence. "All I did was park some heavy machinery." She laughed and squeezed my hand, and I thought about how simple acts can tip the balance in a place held hostage by petty power. The small things matter. So does standing up, even when it would be easier to back down. Late that afternoon, Stan knocked on our door with the official board decision in hand. He looked relieved, maybe even grateful, as he explained the outcome. The board had voted, after considering all the evidence, to censure Karen and remove her from her position as HOA president, effective immediately. Not only that, but they had also agreed to overhaul the enforcement system, requiring transparency and community approval for any new rules or citations. All pending fines against me were voided, the malicious mischief claim was struck from the record, and the ridiculous ban on construction equipment was suspended until a proper vote could be held. For the first time in years, real change had come, not just a slap on the wrist for one person, but a fundamental shift in how things would be run. Word spread quickly, and by that evening, our cul-de-sac turned into an impromptu celebration. Neighbors brought out food and drinks, and someone even hung a homemade sign on the bulldozer that read, "Power to the People." People shared stories, some funny, some maddening, about life under Karen's regime. Even Stan, who had always seemed too nervous to rebel, joined in, raising a toast to the day when common sense finally beat common bylaws. It felt like an ending and a beginning all at once. But then came the twist that almost made me spill my drink. As dusk settled in, a white SUV rolled quietly down the street and parked in Karen's driveway, right behind the bulldozer. Out stepped a sharply dressed woman with a leather briefcase and a tired but determined face. She walked right up to Karen's door and knocked, then waited as Karen reluctantly answered. The woman introduced herself as a private mediator hired by Karen's own family. Apparently, after hearing about the neighborhood's civil unrest, they'd decided it was time for Karen to step away, at least for a while. I overheard snippets of their conversation, talk of stress, burnout, and the suggestion of spending time at the lake house until things cooled off. Karen argued at first, but eventually, I saw her shoulders slump as she nodded and closed the door. The next morning, the street was buzzing with news. Karen had quietly left sometime after midnight, her SUV packed with boxes and her husband's fishing gear sticking out the back. The bulldozer, left behind like a defeated dragon, remained the most interesting thing to ever grace our block. It stood as proof that, just this once, the little guys had won, not with shouting or threats, but with persistence, unity, and a stubborn refusal to back down. A few days later, Mike finally moved the bulldozer, his face split with a grin as the crowd cheered and snapped photos. For weeks, people still stopped by to reminisce, as if the spot where it had stood was some kind of historical site. The HOA, now run by a more level-headed mix of board members, including Maria and even Mrs. Quinn, made good on its promise of transparency. Rule changes were discussed openly at well-attended meetings, and a new committee was formed to review complaints so no one person could abuse the system again. For me and Julia, life settled into a new, less stressful routine. We could come and go as we pleased, park wherever we wanted, and enjoy our home without worrying about some arbitrary infraction appearing on our doorstep. The mailbox stayed navy, no one cared. The fence, now slightly taller thanks to some creative gardening, stood unchallenged. And when our baby arrived, right on time and healthy, the neighbors organized a surprise meal train, dropping off casseroles and gifts with genuine kindness. It was a small thing, but it meant everything. Looking back, I realized the fight with Karen wasn't really about driveways or bulldozers or even HOA rules. It was about drawing a line, about refusing to let fear or pettiness dictate what kind of place you call home. I didn't enjoy every minute of it. There were days when I questioned whether it was worth the stress, the legal bills, or the awkwardness with neighbors. But in the end, I'd do it all again. Sometimes you have to park a bulldozer on a bully's driveway to remind everyone, including yourself, that you have a right to stand your ground. So if you ever find yourself staring down the barrel of a ridiculous HOA demand, or caught in the crosshairs of someone who thrives on control, remember this. Stubbornness is a virtue when you're up against people who rely on you giving up. And sometimes the best way to fight back isn't with anger or revenge, but with creativity, patience, and a sense of humor. Especially if there's a bulldozer handy. Our street isn't perfect now, but it's real, and it's ours. And as for Karen, wherever she's recovering these days, I hope she finally found the peace she couldn't find by policing everyone else's. I'd like to think our bulldozer taught her, and the rest of us, a lesson in what actually builds a neighborhood. Not rules, but respect. Not power, but people. Not threats, but community. And for once, the story ended not with a citation, but with a smile and the quiet, genuine hope that we'll never need a bulldozer to keep things fair again. The blue and red police lights washed across my living room walls before I even heard the doors slam shut. Julia and I exchanged a look, half exasperation, half gallows humor. Then she quietly retreated upstairs, not wanting our unborn child exposed to more of Karen's chaos than strictly necessary. I stepped outside, heart thudding with a strange cocktail of adrenaline and disbelief, and found my front yard already buzzing. Neighbors gathered in small knots, some holding mugs, others clutching their phones like they were live streaming a reality show. The bulldozer stood in silent defiance on Karen's driveway, now outlined by the pulsing glow as two uniformed officers approached. Karen, in a fresh pastel tracksuit, was already in full performance mode on her lawn. She waved her phone overhead as if summoning a crowd to a victory speech. "Officers, thank goodness you're here," she called, her voice projecting across the entire street. "That machine is trespassing and he's been harassing me and violating the law for days." She glared at me as if she could will handcuffs onto my wrist. The officers exchanged a look, then one turned to me, his expression neutral but not unkind. "Sir, can you tell us what's going on with the bulldozer?" the older officer asked. I took a slow breath, keeping my voice as level as I could. "Happy to explain, officer. The bulldozer belongs to my friend, Mike. Karen blocked my driveway with an unauthorized HOA order, so as a joke, I had the dozer parked on hers. It's not stolen, not abandoned, and it's here by permission. It's been no more than an inconvenience, no property damage, no threats, no harm." I offered the keys and Mike's contact information, prepared for whatever came next. Karen leapt in before the officer could respond, her words tumbling over themselves in a rush of indignation. "He's lying. He's been intimidating me and the entire neighborhood. This is construction equipment, not a car, and it's breaking all our HOA rules. It's lowering property values and causing emotional distress." Her face was flushed, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped her phone tighter. I almost felt bad for her, almost. The second officer took a quiet lap around the bulldozer, jotting note. He radioed in the serial number, double-checked for any stolen vehicle alerts, then rejoined his partner. "Ma'am," he said to Karen, "nothing about this machine is reported stolen. We don't see any city code violations. No blocked fire hydrant, sidewalk, or street access. This seems to be a dispute between neighbors and the HOA. Unless you have a restraining order or evidence of a crime, we can't take action." Karen's jaw dropped, stunned at the lack of immediate backup. "But he's violating our bylaws," she cried, her voice teetering on the edge of panic. "That may be, but HOA bylaws are civil matters, not criminal ones," the officer explained patiently. "You'll have to take it up in civil court, ma'am." The crowd rippled with quiet satisfaction, a few neighbors nodding or grinning behind their mugs. The officers took statements, dutifully recording details for their report. As they did, Karen pulled aside Stan and a couple of other board members, cornering them in an urgent huddle on her porch. I heard snippets of frantic strategizing, threats of emergency meetings, legal action, escalating to the county. Meanwhile, the rest of the street was clearly losing patience with her antics. Someone set up a folding table with lemonade and snacks, as if to reclaim the evening as a community block party. Kids ran in circles around the bulldozer, pretending it was a captured dragon from some suburban fairy tale. Mike eventually arrived, paperwork in hand, and clarified to the officers that the bulldozer was both insured and accounted for, with no outstanding issues. The officers thanked us for our cooperation, warned me to be careful about future neighborhood pranks, and told Karen one last time that police involvement was at an end. As they pulled away, a cheer went up from the crowd, not loud, but just bold enough to let Karen know she was outnumbered. For the first time, I saw her hesitate, scanning the faces of her once loyal neighbors and seeing more skepticism than support. But Karen wasn't out of the fight, not by a long shot. If anything, being publicly rebuffed seemed to light a new fire in her. The next morning, I woke to an HOA cease and desist notice taped to my door, drafted with maximum legalese and a sprinkle of personal venom. The letter accused me of malicious mischief, reckless endangerment, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. It threatened thousands in fines, foreclosure proceedings, and even a lawsuit for creating a hostile environment. I read it over coffee, equal parts annoyed and impressed. She was pulling out every stop, escalating the conflict into a full-blown legal saga. Julia suggested I call a lawyer. "Don't give her an inch," she said, her eyes steely. "This is the only way she'll stop." It felt extreme, but I realized she was right. Karen's pattern was clear. Every time someone stood up to her, she cranked up the pressure until they caved. The only way to end it was to meet her escalation with something she wasn't prepared for. Real resistance, not just stubbornness. I made a few calls, finding a local attorney who specialized in HOA dispute. He came by that afternoon, reviewed every notice, email, and complaint Karen had filed. He shook his head after reading through the cease and desist. "She's bluffing on most of this. There's nothing here the HOA can actually enforce, certainly nothing they can foreclose over. And threatening legal action without real cause? That can bite them back." He outlined a strategy: file a formal grievance against Karen for abuse of authority, demand a full board review of her actions, and if necessary, threaten a countersuit for harassment and intimidation. For the first time, I had leverage. Word spread quickly that I'd lawyered up. The support from the neighbors doubled overnight, with several offering to sign statements about Karen's history of arbitrary enforcement and personal vendettas. Even Stan, usually neutral to a fault, stopped by to quietly hand me copies of past meeting minutes, records that made Karen's personal crusades impossible to deny. By sunset, it felt less like a dispute and more like an uprising. The next HOA meeting was scheduled for Friday evening, and Karen, perhaps sensing she was outmatched, spent the days leading up to it in frantic campaign mode. She went door to door, making tearful appeals for community order, warning of chaos if rogue elements like me weren't kept in check. But it was too late. The bulldozer had become a rallying cry, not just against her, but against years of pettiness, overreach, and fear. On Friday night, the community center was packed beyond capacity. People stood shoulder to shoulder, the energy tense and electric. Karen took the floor with a prepared statement, her hands shaking as she read. She spoke of unprecedented disorder, willful disregard for rules, and the threat to property values and safety. Her voice wavered, but she pressed on, determined to reassert control. When she finished, the room was silent, until I stood and, with my attorney beside me, read out our formal complaint. I listed every instance of personal retaliation, selective enforcement, and intimidation. I presented the statements from neighbors, the board minutes, and even photos of her own violations.